This is the Etiology podcast. I am your host, Elka Kubaku, licensed social worker and psychotherapist. In this podcast, we explore divisive issues around food, health, and body image with the goal of mending relationships within the eating disorder recovery professional community and creating a space where a multiplicity of perspectives can coexist harmoniously. This podcast is uncensored and encompasses the political and ideological spectrum. If you believe something you hear is harmful or misinformed, please be respectful to the speaker. And also, feel free to reach out about recording another episode on the same topic from your vantage point. My hope is that if, as professionals, we can hold each other's stories with respect and compassion, we'll be better able to do so for our clients. Does food choice affect mood, energy level, and quality of life? Are some foods healthier than others? Do whole foods, processed foods, and ultra processed foods impact the body differently? What constitutes a healthy diet, if such a thing even exists? In the eating disorder recovery community, these questions have become highly charged and controversial. Many professionals in the field, having seen firsthand the harm caused by restrictive weight loss diets, adopt an all foods fit approach, emphasizing that any and all foods can provide nutrients and fuel for the body. Others argue that ignoring the potential negative effects of highly processed foods and the ways in which profit driven motives, rather than consumer well being, influence their production, does a disservice to those whose bodies are sensitive to excessive food additives. In this episode, Rebecca Perlman approaches these questions with nuance and compassion. She shares her experience of altering food choices to manage small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, SIBO, a rare condition that significantly compromised her ability to function in daily life and left her unable to remain awake past midday. She discusses making dietary adjustments while staying in touch with your body's signals rather than overriding them, and approaching these in a way that is wholesome and kind rather than anxiety provoking. Rebecca is a licensed marriage and family therapist specializing in complex trauma and eating disorders. She approaches eating disorder treatment from a holistic, trauma informed perspective. As a survivor of the troubled teen industry, Rebecca specializes in working with other survivors and serves as an expert trauma consultant for an attorney seeking justice for those affected. She also provides educational courses on healing from complex trauma, which can be found on her website, rebeccaperlman.com. Hi, Rebecca. Thanks so much for joining me today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So in larger society, it's often taken for granted that certain food groups are better for you than others, though different people will say what those are. In the eating disorder community, there's been a pretty strong pushback on that. I want to say largely because people have been taking it to the extreme where they've been monitoring their food to an extent that was harmful for them.
hmm
Tell me about what your position is on the impact on food on health.
Yeah. So my position is eating something is always better than eating nothing.
Mhm.
So if we're looking at an eating disorder where they're really restricting, the first step would be to get them eating in general. However, I do also come from a frame where based on our society and unfortunately the process of food production, both with big ag and big food, that there are certain chemicals, whether that's like the pesticides um,
Mhm.
or like the process of GMOs or additives that are being added to food that can cause health harm. So I hold all of that together.
Yeah. So if somebody's not eating, you're not going to be starting to tell them, well, you shouldn't eat these food groups or should eat these. It's just food is always necessary. And that's very much in line with the more common eating disorder rhetoric.
Yeah, and I'm a therapist, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm not a dietitian. So I actually will never specifically tell a client you shouldn't eat that, and this is why,
Mhm.
um, based off of the nutrition information that I hold inside of myself. Um, so I mean, absolutely, if someone is coming into recovery from a really extreme restricting place and they're eating whatever they're eating, we're going to celebrate the fact that they're able to get any calories and nutrients into their body.
Mm.
It's once um, I hold it in myself at a certain point in the recovery, um, then we can start being curious, but it's only if they bring it in. So if a client doesn't bring it into me, I'm not going to place that on them.
Yeah,
However, if I have a client who's talking about, their desire to only buy organic produce and the price and the stress of that, I'm going to lean into that. I'm not going to tell them, oh, it's fine to just buy the non-organic. I'm going to lean into my, curiosity around why is the organic important, and then
yeah,
trying to help them manage how to get food that is aligned with to them and their health into their bodies. Um, in a way that's enough, nutrients and calories and all of that.
yeah. So your beliefs about the way foods are processed being harmful is not something that you're prescribing for clients. And it also gives you an openness that if they're coming with those values or related values, you're able to meet them in that.
Yes. Yeah, that I think that's a really great way of saying it.
Mhm.
Um yeah, I don't prescribe it to clients because it's just outside of my competency in my role as a therapist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not only that you're willing to meet them there, it's also that you're not going to label that as an eating disorder behavior because I hear a lot of people who will say, yes, like harm reduction. So if this is where somebody's holding and it's really important to them, I still think it's eating disorder behavior, but
Mm,
I'll stay with them in it. And
hmm.
for you, it's like maybe this is actually legitimate.
Yeah, I absolutely thank you for saying that. I do not label it as an eating disorder behavior, with the exception of if it creates an added overwhelming anxiety.
Hmm.
So there are certain people who the stress of getting food that doesn't have more toxins in it is creating such a level of distress to them that we're going to pay attention to that, but I'm still
Yeah.
not going to tell them. Let me think of a thoughtful way to say this. I still agree with them that
Mhm.
the way they want to eat is going to be most helpful and healthy to them, and that what they're afraid of is mostly real. There's enough literature out there that validates this. However, we do want to look at the extent of the fear, right? If I have
Yeah.
one meal from McDonald's, does that mean I'm going to die from cancer? Probably
Hmm.
not. No. Right. So we're
Yeah.
going to take that into consideration. But overall, yes, like I want to lean into the realities of which we're living in, which is this lack of control of what is in our food and how that can
Yeah.
impact us, and how to help a client be with that and choose the foods that feel most aligned for them.
Yeah. If I were to summarize or pull out some of what you value personally that contributes to your position, what I hear is that allowing clients to have their own values rather than imposing your own and being
Mhm.
able to move through that and seeing dysfunction or labeling an eating disorder based on how it's impacting client rather than based on some ideal or something decided on by someone that is the ideal of health.
Mhm.
And it feels like there's something more there as well when it comes to what is health, like a value more related to that. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, well, I was thinking, I was like, I almost think I'm like the flip side of what you had said just
Mhm.
previously, which was that I'm not labeling their desire to eat organic or to not have certain ingredients in their like additives into their food as an eating disorder. Not only am I not viewing that as an eating disorder, but when I have clients who are in recovery and they're eating a lot of highly processed foods, um,
Mhm.
I don't I don't bring it in clinically that I think they would feel better if they ate a little bit differently, but I wish I could. And
Mhm.
again, because it's outside of my lane, I'm not a dietitian, and um, I really can't bring that in a way that's ethical for the limitations of
Yeah.
being a therapist.
Hmm.
Um, but I wish sometimes that I could say, like, let's look at, and it's
Hmm.
not to shame them. It's not
Yeah.
about morality at all. It's
Mhm.
looking at what is the impact of these ingredients and on yourself. And there's so many studies at this
Mhm.
point that show, and I have my personal experience as well, which I
Yeah.
think is what we're going to go into, but
Yeah.
of how we feel better and depression and anxiety decrease,
Hmm.
impulsive tendencies decrease. Like there's just a steadiness inside that and an aliveness that comes on board when we take certain things out of the diet that has been imposed into our diet that is not naturally for thousands and thousands of years has not been in our diets. And I think I lost my train of thought. Hold one moment. I hold that as a dilemma for me as a therapist when working with clients, that if they're not in that space, I'm not going to impose that onto them.
Yeah.
And as a therapist, I'm actually delighted when they come in
Mhm.
and they're wanting to be like, okay, I want to, not have an eating disorder and I want to be able to nourish myself and not feel anxious about eating. And I'm aware of these issues in our society and our food production and how can we work with that so that I'm not anxious all the time, but I also feel really aligned and I feel good inside based off of how I'm nourishing my body.
Mhm.
That makes sense.
Yes. So there's so much there. I'm trying to just pull it out and summarize. When
Yeah.
you describe, so you have this almost dilemma internally where when somebody's talking about a diet that consists maybe entirely of highly processed foods and they're not feeling well, and you have your own experience and have read a lot of research and looked into how food affects the way we feel. So
Mhm.
internally, there's this feeling of, I feel like I know something that can help you.
Mhm.
I'm not able to share it because it's outside my scope of practice.
Yes. Yes.
Mhm. And the difficulty in that is that you like this person who's in front of you, you're in this because you want to be helping people feel better. And
Mm.
it feels like when we disregard the relationship between food and health and food and the way we feel, then we're ignoring a big piece of what can contribute to that.
Yes, I agree completely with that.
Mhm. Yeah.
The limitations of what's considered within my competency as a therapist and being within this role um, is in contrast to how I view health in a more holistic way. And
Hmm.
so I'm a lot of my work with my clients is looking at the wounding that's contributing to this specific eating disorder behavior and beliefs and fears and all of that.
Hmm.
And I'm
Yeah.
great with that. And then there's this whole other piece of
Hmm.
nutrition and how what we eat impacts how we feel in our overall health. And yeah, it's a dilemma of and
Yeah.
a limited uh, capacity of this role for me to help people fully in the ways that I would like to.
Yeah. Health in a holistic way. That's the value piece that I was missing before when I summarized it.
Mm, hmm. Yeah, looking at the whole person, which includes the nutrition. Um, and which is where I am not aligned with the typical approach in the eating disorder professional community
Yeah.
as well.
Let's go into your story. Tell me about
Yeah.
what has led you to this. What has led you to see the importance of understanding how food impacts the way we feel?
Yeah. So I see where I start here. So I did struggle with eating disorder behavior. I struggled with restriction and then binging and at different points in my teenage years and early 20s. And I will say that during that time, intuitive eating was very
Hmm.
helpful for me. I'm just gonna grab a sip of water 1 second.
Yeah, I'm also feeling really dried out, actually. I was woken up very early this morning by my kids and like slept a little bit before we met, so my brain is still coming back to
Mm,
earth.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I in my teens and early 20s found intuitive eating really helpful, and I really let myself eat whatever I wanted
Yeah.
to um, help me um, kind of fight with that compulsion to
Mhm.
restrict or to only eat certain things and then binge and that entire cycle. And then when I was 24, I got really, really sick, and
Mhm.
I was falling asleep between 3 to 5 p.m. at night, sleeping through the night, could not um I'd sleep from like 3 to 7 a.m. and had very little energy when I was awake. People thought I had mono. I got tested for mono. I didn't. And
Mhm.
I ended up getting a really extensive lab work done and with an integrative doctor. And she was very concerned for me. I was sitting in her office and she looks at my lab work and she's like, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't even know how you're sitting here right now. You were deficient in almost everything. And except for
Wait, what
like
kind of
six.
doctor was this? Was this like a medical doctor? Or was this who
Yeah, so
had?
she is a medical doctor. She approached her work in what's known as like an integrative approach. And
Mhm.
so, um, but she had a license, like she had her own practice that was private pay,
Mhm.
so that she could go outside the lines a little and prescribe supplements sometimes where like a more traditional Western doctor would prescribe
Yeah.
um like a prescription.
Mhm.
Um, But yeah, she did a very, very, and she goes also part of her job and why she is private pay. Her blood work is more thorough. They're testing more
Mhm.
things than what you would now normally get at a doctor. And I was deficient in so much. And so at that time, then we started doing all these tests of like what's going on. And um, eventually I got diagnosed with SIBO,
Mhm.
um, which at this point in my life, I actually think SIBO is also a symptom of something else. And SIBO,
Mhm.
this was back in 2015, early 2016. SIBO was a pretty new diagnosis, and there's a lot of questions about why it's there, how to heal it. But the
Mhm.
healing options were very diet based. So they would use diet and antibiotics. So um, I mean, the first few rounds of trying to treat this, she'd actually had me eat very like highly processed food with a
Mhm.
lot of fat to
Mhm.
try and get the bacteria to like come out to eat that. And then it would be put on a really strong antibiotic to try and clear that out.
Wow.
And while I was on the antibiotic, I had to eat very, very, very clean and very restricted. And that in ways that are like much, much more restrictive than anything that I believe today.
Yeah.
Um, and that level of restriction was quite triggering for my eating disorder. Um, but I did it because I was like, I just want my health back. I want to be able to live my life. And we did 2 rounds of that, and it didn't really help. And so she starts sending me other research and other possible diets, and I'm realizing there's a lot that's unknown here about what food is going to
Yeah.
be helpful. So I start doing my own research, and I come across a man named Anthony William, who
Mhm.
is known as the medical medium. He's extremely controversial.
Of
And
course.
his story essentially is that spirit talks to him and has given him all this health information, and that he can
Mhm.
also like know specifically what's wrong in people, and he, through nutrition and supplements, can help people heal. And
Yeah.
I think there's absolutely some truth to what he's doing. And it's nuanced and complicated.
Yeah.
Um, Again, I would never prescribe to an eating disorder client to go do a medical medium diet.
Yeah.
But for my own story, at that time in my life, it was just like some glimmer of hope. Like, okay, thinks that these symptoms make sense. This
Yeah.
is how I should eat. And I ate
Mhm.
pretty much followed his protocol for like
Mhm.
6 months. And in that protocol that I did, it included he actually is really big on celery juice, and I didn't do that at that time, but I did smoothies that he recommended. I took out all gluten, refined
Mm-hmm.
sugar, dairy. I was eating a lot of salads with organic vegetables, and then he is vegan based, but I knew for my body I needed some animal protein, so I would have
Yeah.
one meal of like animal protein a day.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but cooking a lot more at home, took out a lot of fast food type foods. I
Mm-hmm.
would go out, but when I'm
Yeah.
out, I was eating mostly like salads and that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. And I started feeling better. I started having more energy. I was able to live my life again to the extent where after 6 months of that, I was fully back to normal. I could
Mm-hmm.
work 40 hours a week, and I
Oh.
eventually, was ended up in a position where I was working 20 hours and then full time in grad school and managing, the classes and the homework and the papers and the job, and was able to have a full life again. And so,
Mm-hmm.
um, to go from a place where I really had such little quality of life because of these issues to back to being fully vital and got blood work done again. All my nutrients were normal. Um, and um, yeah, so that's like the beginning part of my story. I'll pause there to let you respond.
Okay. I have so many questions. This is very interesting. It's also interesting for me because in some ways my story is a little bit the reverse of yours, which I'll talk to a little bit.
Yeah.
Uh, can you tell me, SIBO, what is it when you talk about is it you talk about there's some bacteria, but food affects it. Tell me like
Yeah.
what is the
I'm actually
yeah.
going to Google what it stands for.
Okay.
Okay, so it stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth.
Okay.
So
So
my understanding, as someone who's not a doctor, of what SIBO is that there's natural bacteria that is in your large intestine that's healthy. And
mhm,
when, for whatever reason, and again, the cause of it isn't clear. Some people think it's high
mhm.
stress, some people think it's other things.
Okay.
For some reason, that healthy bacteria in your large intestine moves up into the small intestine. And your
Okay.
small intestine is the part of your body that is absorbing the nutrients and
Okay.
and telling it where to go in your body.
Hmm.
And instead of that happening, because this bacteria is in your small intestine, it's eating your nutrients.
Oh,
So it's not getting the nutrients that you're eating aren't getting absorbed in your body.
wow. And that's why you were exhausted all the time.
Because I hadn't, even though I was eating plenty, I was not able to. I was deficient in a lot of
Yeah.
very important nutrients. Yeah,
Well, when you discovered intuitive eating, what were you coming from
yeah, that's
that
a great
intuitive eating
question.
was the answer to?
Yes, so I was actually very fortunate to discover intuitive eating at 14.
Mhm.
Um, so when I was 12, 13, and 14, I was a little bit on the heavier side, but not anything alarming.
Yeah.
And my mom was not happy with that. And so I got placed on a lot of different diets. There was a
Yeah.
lot of pressure
Mhm.
starting at 12 years old to either be in a pretty intensive diet to be actively losing weight or to be maintaining that weight. A lot of what I could eat, a lot of what I can't eat, a lot of shame around
Yeah.
eating too much or eating t sugar foods and all of that.
Yeah.
And my mom actually took me to a dietitian at
Mhm.
14 when she was frustrated. We were just in an autonomy battle. I didn't
Yeah.
want to diet anymore, and she thought it was really important. And
Hmm.
I think she thought the dietitian was going to tell her, kind of prescribe me a diet. So she was going to get her way. And
Hmm.
instead, the dietitian handed me the book Intuitive Eating and told
Wow.
my mom that she needs to stop commenting about calories, stop commenting about what I eat, stop commenting about my body, and allow me to do this intuitive eating program, or I'm at a very high risk for getting an eating disorder.
Hmm.
And so I was coming into it from a lot of pressure around what's okay to eat, what's not okay to eat, how much is okay to eat, when, and this book just, it like clicked in my brain at
Yeah.
14, like, this makes sense. Like our
Hmm.
bodies know.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I still hold that our
Hmm.
bodies know. However, I, my view is that there are so many additives and chemicals being placed in our food, whether it's at the level of the agriculture or the processed foods that we're seeing, that it's
Hmm.
hijacking our brain and it's disconnecting us from a capacity to be in that intuitive eating place.
Yeah.
And that if we take those out of our diet, intuitive eating becomes much more um, possible.
Yeah. Our bodies know that that was the value that you have then and still have now. And a part of that is staying close to our bodies or taking out some of the things that pull us away. And those can be both emotional and physical.
Hmm. Yeah. And I believe, there's certain ingredients that, not believe, but through the research and from my experimenting with myself and some of my clients, that it hijacks our brain to make us crave that food more.
Yeah.
And so um, that almost feels like handing someone a cigarette and asking them intuitively smoke the cigarette. Like we wouldn't do that.
Hmm.
So if we remove those ingredients, then it gives us more capacity to genuinely be able to sense into our body, to feel satiated, and then to
Yeah.
know when we need to eat and what we want to eat.
Yeah. I'm going to actually ask you, I'll email you after this, but if you can send me links to a couple of those articles
Yeah.
that we're focusing more on your personal story. I feel like when people hear like research says they want to see which research or something. So I'll link
Mhm.
those in the show notes then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So you were coming from being put on a diet at a very young age, and
Hmm.
that diet was restrictive. I'm understanding both in quantity and in terms of what foods are good versus bad.
Yes.
And they gave you a lot of guilt and shame around food and your body.
Yeah, definitely a lot of shame around my body and a lot of stress around food.
Yeah.
Um, where if like I was fighting what I
Hmm.
wanted to eat versus like how I wanted my body to look.
Hmm.
Um, and also just trying to avoid being shamed for eating certain foods as well.
Yeah. And the restrict binge pattern, which you mentioned before, did that start during that period or was that at a later time?
It started, so yeah, I'd say like prior to the dieting, I relied heavily on food I was
Mm-hmm.
like an emotional eater, so there's like for comfort. And then
Hmm.
the dieting kind of like took that away from me and
Hmm.
forced me into restricting, which I could maintain for a period of time. And then it did, yes, there was like a restrict and binge
Hmm.
period that started, yeah, like 13 or 14. Um, And even once I learned intuitive eating, as is common in the,
Hmm.
healing process, I would lean fully into it and then I'd start restricting again and then be like, okay, I have to go back to this intuitive eating. Um,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. So before the dieting, there was a time when you would eat more to cope with painful emotions. The restrictive dieting took that away.
Hmm. Yeah. I think it just made it more complicated.
Mhm.
Um, but food was, I
Yeah.
think, like a resource for comfort when I was
Hmm.
younger. And I'd say a resource for pleasure as well. And
Hmm.
and then when I was, yeah, in my teens, just the body image and my desire to eat certain foods was just at odds.
Yeah.
Um, and I am grateful that I had intuitive eating in my back pocket because I think it kept me
Hmm.
from a clinical perspective, my restriction and binging was very mild.
Yeah.
Um, And it could have gotten much, much more severe if I didn't have that place to check myself and kind of lean back into that intuitive eating.
Yeah.
Um, and then as I went to college, I experienced some different eating disorder symptoms, which has really informed my work as a therapist, more attachment based, restricting, where my nervous system was so overwhelmed that I couldn't eat.
Yeah.
And then once I like could have a bite of food, I realized how hungry I was, and then I would binge,
hmm
um,
Yeah.
which is a little bit different than what I was experiencing in middle school and high school.
Yeah. So in middle school and high school, it was more of the, I don't know, I want to say classic, like body image based restricting. And
Mm,
then either your body fights back or you're not feeling good and
mm,
want to eat more in response to that. And then when you got to college, it was more of a being unable to eat because of emotions you were experiencing or attachment
mhm.
stuff.
Yeah, I would say that's correct. My nervous system, excuse me, my nervous system got through different like losses that I went through in
hmm
early college was got really dysregulated, and I got triggered back to I think very, very early wounding that had been
hmm
um like inactive for a while. And in that space, yeah, I just couldn't eat. Food became very threatening,
hmm
not to my body image, but to it, my nervous system. I would look at food and I would just feel like I can't eat it.
Yeah. This is starting to resemble a little bit of, we have a couple of episodes in the future where we'll talk more about attachment and eating disorders or eating disorders as a way of expressing emotions or so it's resembling a conversation I had with someone else. I'm going to come back to the intuitive eating piece. So when you were in this diet mentality, can you speak more about what intuitive eating gave you and why it was so important for you at that time?
Yeah, I think the greatest harm of dieting is it creates a battle between
Mhm.
a knowing inside of us
Yeah.
and what we're quote supposed to do. You're
hmm
constantly fighting this part of us. Like there's two different needs. There's like a need for connection and belonging, and I'm going to get that through dieting and having a body look a certain
Yeah.
way. And there's
hmm
a need coming from my body to eat a certain way to nourish it,
hmm
and a need for pleasure with food and a need for, you know,
Yeah.
feeling nourished. And the diet culture and the dieting puts these needs at odds. And there's
Yep.
this constant battle back and forth. And it's like a
hmm
autonomy battle
Yep.
and a connection battle. And
hmm
it's really uncomfortable for anyone going through it.
Yeah.
I've never met a person who enjoys dieting. I've met
Yeah.
many people who do it. And it's like
Mhm.
for the people who are doing it feels like a necessary evil of sorts. Um, and that's because we're having to put aside natural instincts
Yep.
for another need, which is this
hmm
connection and belonging that we think we'll get on the other side of it.
hmm
And so intuitive eating, I mean, it was just this permission. Like, you don't have to do that.
You
You
don't have to fight your
have
body.
to control yourself so much. You don't have to push away that desire. Let yourself have the desire. You want a brownie right now? Eat the brownie. You can have the brownie. And it
Mhm.
just was this full permission of myself, of my desires, of my wants. And
Mhm.
as you probably know, as we allow that to expand and allow ourselves to want it, then we get to experience the full thing where when I know I can always have the brownie, then it
Mhm.
can be available and I don't really want it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it took away the friction between social needs and what your body wanted.
hmm And that internal fight of myself to
Mhm.
push away this desire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like so many people in the eating disorder field, their story stops right there.
Mm, hmm
It's almost like if we were to rewind your story and put a pause on that moment right there,
mm,
you would be in that camp saying, just eat what your body wants.
yep,
And at a certain point, your body said no to that.
it did. And this is where I believe if our food was made in what I believe would be a more ethical way, right?
Hmm.
If the brownies that we can
Hmm.
buy at the grocery store that are pre-made was just organic flour. I don't really know the ingredients, but it's like organic flour, eggs, sugar,
Hmm.
chocolate, organic like cacao, um, salt. That would be fine.
Yep.
That would be fine. Um, and the problem is that when if you go to your local grocery store and they're pre-made brownies and you look at the ingredients, there's 30 to 40 ingredients in there.
Yep.
And I don't even know what they all are. I know some of them that are
Yeah.
natural ones and some of them that are more harmful, and there's some that I have absolutely no idea. And that's the part where it's hijacking our brain and
Yeah.
capacity to be able to know what we want.
Hmm.
And that's where I then steer. I disagree with the other clinicians who are fully intuitive eating because of that aspect.
Hmm. It's not that we're talking about implementing food rules to ignore our body. It's that something in the way that food is set up in our society disconnects us from our body. And in order to reconnect to our body,
Yeah,
we
that's a
step
very
away.
beautiful way to say it. Yeah. Yeah.
Tell me about that process when you were put on this very restrictive diet for your SIBO, started following some food rules that you said you would never recommend for clients. What was that like for you?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the
Yeah.
question?
So when you started on this very restrictive diet for your SIBO,
Mhm.
I guess I'll
Yeah.
make the question a little bit more specific.
Okay.
You had touched on it being really difficult to someone who's had past experience of an eating disorder.
hmm
What did that trigger for you, and how did you maintain it or stick with this despite that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there were two different diets that I got put on. So the first one was the diet that was I was given by the integrative doctor,
Yeah.
prescribed specifically for SIBO. And that
Mm-hmm.
was it was just yeah, it was very triggering. So I mean at first it's like eat all you want,
Mm-hmm.
unhealthy, which
Yeah.
was fun. I'd say I'm like, all right, I'm, eating
Mm-hmm.
donuts and burritos and pizza and ice cream in one day and just
Yep.
what I wanted. But and then what's interesting though is that when you do that, especially
Mm-hmm.
with the additives that are naturally in those foods where I was getting them from,
Yeah.
there's more of like a withdrawal is like maybe too strong of a word because it's not the same as like a drug
Yeah.
addiction withdrawal, but like I would
Mhm.
have even more cravings for those foods
Yep.
as I'm cutting them out because I just ate so much of them.
Yeah.
And um and so then that strictness, I mean, it was hard. There was definitely a battle. There was a protest inside of I don't want to do this. I
Yep.
don't want to eat these cooked
Mhm.
veggies that are just very bland for my meal. I and there's a constant like I want this, I want this, I want this coming from internally
Yep.
that went completely against my intuitive eating
Yeah.
learning and experiences. And
Hmm.
um, it was something I think I was able to get through that by in two ways. One was
Hmm.
this is very temporary. This
Yep.
is just maybe a few weeks or maybe a few months of this. This isn't forever. And my health is at stake. The quality of my life is at stake. And in this moment, it's how badly do I want more energy? How badly do I really want to get to live my life?
Yep.
And but yeah, it was hard.
Hmm.
And then the hardest part then was so that was like round one. Then we had to do round two. So then I went from super
Hmm.
restricting now to being like eat again intentionally all these processed high
Oh
fat
my gosh. Wow.
foods, which really then mimicked a binge for me. And
Mhm.
I don't think I did that well. I absolutely was overeating in
Mhm.
in a sense of this. I have a very limited amount of time that I can eat these foods, and my system
Wow.
as much of it as possible.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That sounds like an external setup for everything that triggers the restrict binge cycle. It's almost like you're being you I mean you literally were prescribed the restrict binge pattern.
In a sense, I don't think, the doctor wouldn't say, I didn't tell you to binge on these foods. I
Right.
told you to eat them in a
Right.
moderate way. But that was very hard for me to do, knowing that I was going to have to restrict so heavily afterwards.
Yeah. And so what carried you through the, I don't know if you want to call it the restriction phase, but the more limited food
Hmm.
phase was this is painful and it's short term and it's worth it for to get my life back.
Yeah, it's like when I was younger, like a mentor like would say to play the tape all the way through
Hmm.
when you're making decisions, or like when you're tempted to make a decision that might be like a self-sabotage decision.
Hmm.
And so in those moments, and I'm like, man, I really just want
Hmm.
whatever it is that I wanted that wasn't within the diet. Playing the
Yeah.
tape all the way through was my health. It's
Hmm.
being able
Yeah.
to go to work and provide for myself. It's being able to hang out with friends. It's an entire future of
Hmm.
living versus I was sleeping most of the day and in a lot of pain. And so that allowed me to stick to that diet for that
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
Play the tape all the way through.
Mm. It's a very 90s reference, like a tape,
Mhm.
like a videotape, but
Yeah.
um
It's kind of a nice visualization. Like also just in terms of making decisions that are aligned with values and long-term goals.
yeah. Yeah.
After the second stage of that, so you have the stage where you're again allowed to or even encouraged to eat all these foods. You experience the pushback to the restriction where you just want more. When you go back into the restriction phase, you experience the after effects of the eat all you want phase, which is you're having stronger cravings.
Hmm.
And then at the point when you transition to the second diet based on the
Hmm.
um, other person,
Yeah.
I forget their name.
It's fine. The medical medium. Yeah, Anthony
Yeah, the
Williams.
medical medium. What was
Yeah.
that like for you?
Um, so oddly, like that diet was somewhere in the middle. Actually, the SIBO diet had been so restrictive. I wasn't even allowed to have salad on the SIBO diet. Every vegetable had to be cooked.
Mm,
Um, so even just like the palate options opening up of I can make
yeah.
yummy salads for myself, um,
Hmm.
felt a little bit more spacious. And it I think was a very similar thing where um I of course like wanted other foods, and I wasn't perfect with it. Sometimes I would occasionally, like to go out. I was in a relationship, like, go out with my girlfriend and we'd get Thai food, and I would just have
Hmm.
Thai, whatever was in that I didn't know um the specific ingredients. But in general, I was eating so many more
Hmm.
organic, fresh, quote, clean foods that
Hmm.
didn't have these additives. And it was the same thing. And I think it was really reinforcing once I started to feel a little bit better,
Yeah.
right? So as I start to have more energy, then I'm like, okay, this is working. And that's
Hmm.
self-reinforcing to help me continue to say no to the other foods as I'm gaining my health back.
Hmm. Yeah. So in the beginning, it may have been difficult, and then once you started to experience the positive effects, it carried itself more.
Yeah, it was
There.
very difficult. And I got here in like like this rock bottom kind of way. And I don't wish this on
Right.
anybody, right? But
Yeah.
I was really at a place where it's like, if I don't do this, there's not much point in living. So I'm gonna
Mm.
be able to do this for my diet with the hope that my life is gonna get better.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Mhm. Where are you now in terms of
Yeah, it's a
like your,
great question.
yeah,
So I'll say like after, so I did that diet really strict for about 6 months. It was not
mhm,
a lifetime change. And
yeah,
then as I started eating more, just going back to regular foods, going out more, buying
yeah,
like frozen foods at the grocery store to make it easy to cook.
yeah,
Um, I started noticing that like, oh, I wasn't feeling as good. Like, oh, I'm
mhm,
feeling a lot lower energy or have more anxiety.
yeah,
Um, and so it's just opened me up and I've gone, since this was back in 2016, um,
mhm,
looking at 9 years ago, there's been
yeah,
different stages where there's been times where I'm like, I just want to eat what I want to eat. And I've gone back to the intuitive eating. And then I realize I don't feel good in my body. Yes, I'm
mhm,
eating what I'm eating, but I don't feel nearly as good as I
yeah,
felt when I was eating on the stricter diet. And so
mhm,
at this point, I'm nowhere near as strict as I was then, but I'm intentional with
yeah,
food I buy at the grocery. So I buy like all organic foods at the grocery. I'm checking the ingredients for there's certain additives that I don't want to be putting in my body because I know I don't feel good when I eat them, or there's some longer term health studies that I just don't want those health issues later down the line.
mhm,
And um, so there's like a general wellness eating that of like what foods I'll bring into my home from
yeah,
the grocery. And then when I go out,
mhm,
I'm not that picky. I'll try to pick restaurants that I know use organic produce, but if somebody, wants to go somewhere that I don't know anything about that food, like I'm willing to eat it. I just know like the next day I'm gonna feel a little bit more sluggish. The next day I'm not gonna feel as good, and that's something that uh,
mhm,
yeah, that I accept and allow myself to do.
yeah. It feels qualitatively very different from the restrictive and food judgment mentality that intuitive eating is up against,
Hmm.
where that is so much fear-based this I feel like comes back to what you were saying before, where you'll start to look at it if somebody's presenting with a lot of anxiety about eating the wrong foods, you'll start looking at that where
Hmm.
it's so much fear-based. Whereas what you're describing now, it feels more value and long-term goals based.
Hmm.
And also alongside that, it's not disastrous if you move outside of it temporarily. Like there are situations where it's like, okay, I choose in this situation, I prefer to just eat with my friends or
Hmm. Yes, that's a really great way to say it. Um, and there are things, let's see. You said something and I was like, oh, I have a good
mhm,
thought to say and I lost it. Um, But yeah, we're not looking, I don't want to instill fear. There's knowledge and education, but I don't want it to be anxiety. And it's really common when people start to learn about it that there is some anxiety and
mhm,
anger, anger at
yeah,
the system, anger at they're making a lot of money. And these
yeah,
companies that are doing this are subsidized. So our taxpayer dollars are being used to create this food. And
mhm,
that is not as healthy for us as food can be. And
mhm,
so that's like all a part of that emotional work of coming in touch with it.
mhm,
The other side, though, is yes, like it's what we call agency. It's a way to relate of this is what I
mhm,
value, this is what I want in my body. If I have this one thing, I'm going to be okay most of the time. There are
yeah,
exceptions. So, for instance, I can't eat at Taco Bell because it will upset my stomach so much now.
yeah,
Like my body lost an ability to digest that type of food.
mhm, yeah,
So there are exceptions where there are some foods now that I just really can't eat. Um, but in general, yeah, there's more spaciousness around it, and there is an element of intuitive eating that is still
yeah,
here, right? I can say like, I really want to eat this pizza. I'm craving this pizza. It smells delicious. And I know that tomorrow I'm gonna feel really bad
Hmm.
when I if I eat this pizza.
Yeah.
And sometimes I let myself, right?
Mm.
Sometimes I'm like, okay, but the pleasure of this moment and the satisfaction, and I really want it. Okay. And the next morning, I'm like, oh man, okay. I feel blah today. I did this to myself yesterday, and
Hmm.
it's okay. I'm okay. And we just
Yeah.
keep going.
And that's where the agency piece is.
Yeah.
I can make a choice that doesn't make me feel great, and I can acknowledge that that was my choice without feeling helpless or ashamed of it.
Mhm. Yeah. And that this one choice isn't most likely going to lead to a catastrophic health issue. So that is something, and we're looking at orthorexia. And again, I'm very cautious with diagnosing orthorexia because there is all this research that shows potential that some of these chemicals, oh
Or a
no,
cup of coffee to myself.
oh no,
Okay.
are you okay?
Yep, I'm good.
Okay. So there is this research that shows potentially that these ingredients there's like carcinogenic qualities to some of these ingredients that can lead to cancer or other health issues. And so then there's also a stepping back of like, okay, in general, I don't eat this. If I eat this once a month or a few times a year, is that going to cause cancer? Most likely not. So there's also like the balancing of that, but
Yep.
honoring it enough that I'm not eating it every single day or multiple times a day, which some people do.
Yeah. So you don't want to be pathologizing someone who has really strong values in terms of eating. Is it eating foods that are closer to the ground, or how would you describe your approach to?
That's a great question. I'd say sure. Yeah, it's an interesting way to say it. Eating foods that are closer to the ground. Like, just if you're going to think about how we've made food for thousands of years, minus the past 50 to 70 years, right?
Mhm.
So, like, harvesting fruits and vegetables that were not GMO, we didn't have pesticides, there are all these extra things. We just plant a seed and we water it, and the sun shines on it, and it comes, right? That's
Yep.
going to have the most nutrients. But other things are okay. We've had bread and
Mhm.
cake and cookies for a long time as well.
Yep.
And flour, I don't actually know when flour was discovered, but it was a long time ago. And
Mhm.
but there's still it's a very pure process of creating that flour from the wheat. And the ingredients in the cake are what we call organic prior to GMOs was just regular. It was just what all that was available, right? That is just the natural thing. So if we're looking at organic flour, which is again just the natural, what is naturally grown on this earth for thousands of years, um, eggs, sugar, um, I don't know
Mhm.
all the ingredients, but I think you know what I like what I mean.
Mhm.
That you're just when you can dissect it to like those pure ingredients, then that's fine. And there are
Mhm.
people who will, refined sugar is a controversial topic, and there are people that will say we can get addicted to refined sugar. We shouldn't have any refined sugar. We should be using like coconut sugar or other types of sugar. And I'm more loose with that. I do think refined sugar can have an addictive quality to it, but that's nowhere near the danger or the health like impact that some of these additives have. Like
Mhm.
sugar is not gonna
Yeah.
hurt you. It just might make you crave it more.
Hmm. Yeah. Do you have a strict cutoff? Do you have somewhere that you have to be in a few minutes?
No, I'm okay. We can keep going.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
Good. Yeah, my schedule today is actually a little looser. Um,
thank you for
so
asking.
yeah. So it's more of a like purity of ingredients, less additives, um,
Hmm.
things that were considered food throughout our history and ancestors.
Hmm. Yeah.
It's interesting to me. I feel like almost the fundamental, like if we were to take this back a step to like the fundamental, I don't know, value difference, which it feels like you can almost divide all people into these two groups where
Mhm.
it's like is I don't know, is health and wellness or the value to connect to what was before us, to what our
Mhm.
ancestors did, what's been around for thousands of years, or
Mhm.
is the value to move away from the past and move toward
Mm.
the advances of technology and science. And
Mhm.
it feels like does that feel
Mhm.
like it captures some of the, I don't know, more
That's an
fundamental?
interesting way to view it. And I think there's, some nuance in
Mm,
there. And I could see how what I was saying makes it sound like that. Um,
mm,
so it's not that I'm not open to advancement. I think we
yeah.
need to be curious and discerning about what is the advancement, right? Like
Yeah.
we can even take something like a smartphone, which obviously has so many positive features, and it's
Right.
addicting, and it's taking
Mhm.
us away from being present from each other in person, and all these
Yeah.
things, there's these pros and cons. And so again, there's in certain circumstances, like adding something that to a food that's going to make it have a longer shelf life, there's value to
Yeah.
that, right? There's value to being able to store food for longer periods of time. It's more accessible to people, et cetera. Where I question it is more what is that property that's allowing it the shelf life and
Mhm.
what research has been done on it,
Yeah.
and how does that impact us?
Hmm.
And and right now we're in a state where we have a lot of additives that are increasing shelf life, but do have negative both mental health impacts and physical health impacts on
Yeah.
people. And so that's the part where I'm like, I don't know that that's as progressive as we're actually wanting it to be.
Yeah. So there is a marriage between the two, between the new
Mhm.
and the old. There's this book that's coming to mind. I can't remember what it was. It was fiction. What was it? But where there were like these two people who embodied like the science and magic, I think was how they phrased it. And then like the it ended with the bringing of them together and like seeing the space for both of them. Um,
Mm.
I don't know why, or I do know why, but that visual is kind of coming to my mind. Yeah. I'm debating whether I in some ways my experience was similar to yours, but ended up very different. Before I actually go into that, one other question
Yeah.
that I had for you was when how did shifting to this more I don't know, wholesome way of eating, if you want to call it that,
Mhm.
how did that shift your cravings? Because you had mentioned before that
Yeah.
when you were eating all these foods, you had really strong cravings for them. How is that now? And how is it affected by that?
Yeah. So I will still notice the more like whole foods I'm eating, the less I'm craving junk food, specifically refined sugar.
Mm,
Um, and then even like chips. So chips is an interesting experiment. I actually invite
mhm,
anyone listening to try this experiment. You can buy a bag of chips that has natural flavors or artificial flavors and try to just limit yourself to like a small bowl of them and
mhm,
notice, be like, okay, I'm just going to have this small bowl. Are you able to just eat the small bowl and feel satisfied and put the
mhm,
chips away? And then you can buy another bag of chips in a different setting. So give yourself at least a day in between these two experiments. A bag, there's many now brands at grocery stores, even mainstream ones. You don't have to go to like a organic store, um, where they don't have artificial flavors or natural flavors in the chips.
mhm,
You're looking for something just like olive oil, avocado oil, salt, and like potato or whatever kind of chip you're eating, and see if you can just have a bowl of that. And what I notice is that I can have just a small amount if I'm craving some salt and some chips. I have a greater capacity to just eat that versus
mhm,
if there's something with all these additives, it's like mindless. I just keep
mhm.
putting more in my mouth and I just keep wanting more. Um, so that is a really big shift.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
It sounds like something they would do at a larger scale in the research on ultra processed food
Hmm. Yeah,
addiction.
and I've had clients where I invite them into that, and they will
Hmm.
like they'll be frustrated. Like I know I didn't want to eat this whole bag of chips. That's like, family style, meant for many servings, and I did. And I've said like get one without these ingredients and see, and then they're like, oh yeah, I can portion it and intuitively eat this other bag of chips. So
Very interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. So I'm recovered from binge eating disorder and had like the restrict binge cycle. And I feel like my recovery was unusual in the sense that, so I was also very, very low energy,
Mm,
a lot of like brain fog, hard time thinking clearly. And I'm like very much a student, teacher, learner. So it was very difficult. And I had gone to an acupuncturist who had also told me like cut out wheat, refined
mm,
sugar, and dairy. And I had also like recovered using a just kind of interesting and a little bit harsh approach that is one of those like love hate where half the reviews are like this is terrible, he's encouraging shame and eating disorders, and the other half are like this is the only thing that worked for me. But recover with very much, I want to say, what people might call abstinence-based approach. So I was like, no wheat, sugar, dairy. And I
mm,
can't say with certainty that it affected my health. Having the
mm,
clear lines at the time was helpful for me.
mm,
Like getting past the binge eating part because I was having just like impossible urges and cravings. So just
mm,
having a clear way of identifying that gave me a way of like recognizing clearly when those urges were present and coping with them. Uh,
mm,
and then also, I guess where my experience is more similar to yours is that at a certain point, like after once I got fully past the eating disorder, and also maybe there is an attachment piece to this too. Now that I'm thinking about it,
mm,
when I got into a relationship, that was actually the first time I remember like letting go of some of that. And like I had met
mm,
with the person who's now my husband in Florida, and just like I wasn't going to be that particular about what we ate. And so I did not see like a clear correlation. And I'm at a place maybe a little similar to you, but probably less so, where I do like want to eat more holistically, but also just like if it's not convenient, I don't. And I don't think I'm as sensitive to it as you. Like I don't really
mm,
experience um,
mm,
after effects like you do.
mm,
So for me, it purely is a value, just internal
mm,
value that like
mm.
I'm like, I can't say that this has an effect or doesn't have an effect. It's just I sort of like I guess I'm a little more in the like connect to nature and
Yeah.
to what was.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like you're like there's a value of being back in that like connection with nature and the natural foods, but that if you eat something that's more highly processed, you don't feel it in your body the way that I feel it in my body. Which
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
And I do think there's something really to that. Some people are more sensitive to
for
the
sure.
highly processed foods, which I also think contributes to this big split that we see in the industry because people
Yeah,
who are not sensitive to it feel very sure that they can say this doesn't impact you. And then
yeah,
there's other people who are impacted and they're like, no, it actually does. I
mm,
don't feel good when I
right.
eat these other foods.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like the difference in the way we experience it determines, or to some extent, which camp will fall in. I do feel like having had that experience of recovering while on something that would be more
Mm,
restrictive gives me
mhm,
more openness. Like I've created a curriculum for a binge eating recovery program, and one
mhm,
of my pieces is like you get to choose what your food values are, and we can work on creating that, or we can practice ways of getting to that. So I feel like I don't have the almost like the catastrophic experience the other way, where it's like if you
mhm.
keep restricting, you will keep binge eating.
If you keep restrict, so can you say that again? That when you're
Yeah.
saying food values, are you also talking about restricting?
Well, so I mean, by restricting, I mean cutting out particular food groups.
Okay.
So yeah,
So
I
not
should,
restricting calories, but restricting certain
yeah,
types of food. Okay.
yeah. So like in the I feel like in the strictly intuitive eating camp, there's a lot of like if you're cutting out food groups, you will keep binging. You'll experience this really deep and intense deprivation that will make you go back.
Hmm.
But um which so like from my perspective, I do feel like as like in line with what you said, there is space to if this is somebody's food values and food vision and like you're describing helps you feel better, there's space to work with that without pathologizing it.
Yes, you just went out for a moment, but
Yeah, you
back in.
just yeah.
Yeah, so without path, yes. I think something that I want to speak to is that if anyone is ever forced, not ever, I won't use that language, but typically if somebody is forced to just take out these foods, there's going to be a deprivation experience. And
Mhm.
it comes from our autonomy. Like
Yep.
you're taking away someone's right to have something that they want. And so instead of or just to have something in general, right? And so instead of even being in touch if they really want that for themselves, what
Hmm.
can happen, and especially if there's autonomy wounding in childhood, is that if someone says, no, you can't have this, then there's like a F you, I want
Hmm.
it even more because you're
Yep.
saying you can't.
Hmm.
And so I also agree that like I, I
Hmm.
mean, as a therapist, I don't tell people what they can and can't eat to begin with, but even if we were going to go there, I would never tell someone not to eat something. What I want for them is for them to get in touch with their values and what they want and to know that they can always choose to do it. And I approach everything in this way, right? Even if we're looking at actual restricting of calories or purging or binging or doing a drug that they don't want to be doing or drinking alcohol, the choice is always there. You can
Hmm.
say yes.
Yep.
Oh, that is always an option. So what is your why is going to be really important for why you're saying no or why you're making a different choice.
That's such a great way of putting it. That deprivation comes when we're being pushed by something external. And this is what you described when you were motivated by
Mhm.
something internal. I want my life back. You were
Mhm.
able to you were able to stay with it.
Yeah.
Um, and maybe did have some of the pushback, but it wasn't overwhelming. It didn't swallow you up in the same way that it might have if somebody else was pushing it on you, which is often where people are entering from
Mhm.
with
Yes.
diet culture and
Yes. Which I do think is why, like, if someone has a really intense restrict, or even just restriction or restriction binge symptoms, the first step is just let's get anything into you. We're just looking
yeah.
at what is in the way of feeding yourself any sort of
Mhm.
caloric intake to get energy and nutrients into your body. That's step number one. Then we can look at what are those things that you're eating and how do those specific things make you feel? What are potential long-term effects of these foods? Um, but it's where it can come from that like intuitive place, like
Mhm.
I just use the chips example, is
Mhm.
if you're at the grocery store, right, you can be like, okay, do I want to buy a bag of chips that's going to be hard for me to stop eating once I start, or do I want to buy a bag of chips that I'll be able to intuitively eat?
Yeah.
That feels like a more simple
Hmm.
approach versus you can't have this because it has these
Yep.
ingredients. Yeah, no, you can. Go for it. This is your body and it's
Mhm.
your relationship with food. And so
Yeah.
really helping them get in touch with their autonomy and then from the autonomy as agency.
Yeah. And it feels like that actually is very much aligned with maybe not the way that intuitive eating is expressed in a lot of spaces, but some of the, I forget what number principle it was, but the noticing how food makes you feel and
Yes.
moving based on that, based on what your body's feeling and what you're feeling internally
Hmm.
imposed.
Yes. Absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. What do you want to leave our listeners off with? What's the message that you want people to come away from this with?
Ooh, that's a very good question. I think what I would love for anyone listening to take away is a curiosity about what they're putting in their bodies and the impact that it has, whether that is um, how you're going to feel emotionally or potential health impacts down the line. But then also, as we're noticing that, notice how you're talking to yourself about it. And
Hmm.
is there shame? Are you being hard on yourself? So, is there space to notice the impact while still being compassionate towards yourself in this really confusing journey and um, messy, like food options that we have?
Awesome. Thanks so much. Where can people find you if they're interested in learning more about what you do or working with you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have an Instagram, which is my name, Rebecca Perlman, and I'm have two different businesses. So I have my therapy practice is RebeccaPerlmanTherapy.com. Then I
Mhm.
also have an LLC where I'm running educational programs. And I
Mhm.
am going to be running a 4-week program that's looking at understanding complex trauma, which is that childhood attachment wounding, um, and how it impacts us in adulthood. And some of that is the eating disorder
Mhm.
symptoms. That's going to be starting in March. So if you're interested, you can find that information at RebeccaPerlman.com or from my Instagram, which is at Rebecca Perlman.
Awesome. Very cool. Thanks so much, Rebecca.
Thank you.